Hello friends, my name is Hannah and welcome to my October wrap-up. I think I had a really good reading month in October, even though it felt like I wasn't reading very much. It's a pretty good stack of books I've got to talk to you about today. Oh, I've just trimmed my fringe and yeah, she's done an excellent job. Oh well. So the first book that I read in October was an essay collection by Gia Tolentino called Trick Mirror, Reflections on Self-Delusion. Here it is. And I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really interesting, although having read it, I think I finished it like the first day of October, so I actually mostly read it in September. I can't remember too many specifics because Hannah lost the plot, but I did really like it. She's got a really engaging, fun writing style. The essays were all sort of, they were really varied in terms of subject matter, but a lot of it was about identity and personhood and the internet and technology and social media or kind of more traditional media, and it was really, really interesting. Sort of Gia talks about kind of growing up in like same generation as me, really, where you can remember the point at which social media began, and that there was a definite kind of shift in how our interactions started changing over time. So it was really, really interesting. I really recommend it as a kind of not too heavy but still very interesting essay collection. There was one in particular that I really liked that was about, so Gia was on like a reality TV show when she was like 16, and she talks about how she watched episodes back more recently and her memory of how things happened aren't how they actually happened, and kind of, so there's lots of, reflections on self-delusion, right? So she's essentially like picking away at all of the things she assumes she understands about herself and kind of really interrogating that. But there's a lot in there about like media and culture more broadly, and I really liked it, and I will be reading more of her writing, I think. And then there are a chunk of books that I'm not going to talk about in tons of detail because they're all in last week's video, which was a kind of autumnal reading vlog, so I'm not going to go into tons of detail on them. Basically, I was feeling grumpy and moody and sad at the start of this month and decided to pick up books off my shelf that I thought were going to give me that were giving me like autumn vibes, not necessarily literally, but there are certain genres that I gravitate towards as the kind of days get a little bit shorter. I think a lot of people do, so kind of like maybe a bit more fantasy stuff, maybe a bit of spooky stuff, but also kind of classics. So with that brief introduction, the first book I read is Babel by R F Kuang, and I really enjoyed this. I don't know if I loved it, but I respect the heck out of it. This, as many people will be aware, is a kind of dark academia fantasy book in a version of the world, a version of Britain, where there's this sort of magic that you can do that's all to do with translation and language, and the sort of the gaps in meaning between translated words sort of hold an energy that these scholars can use silver bars to kind of capture that magic, and they can do all sorts of things with it. But and the magic system was like really, really cool and really compelling. Like I've never come across a magic system like that before, and it really made me want to speak all of the languages. And so like from just a straight up like I'm interested in linguistics and languages and translation, that was fascinating. But it's also at its heart a real kind of evisceration of British colonialism. So essentially, Babel is a college at the University of Oxford, and in order for them to spearhead, as they do, this magic development, they need resources. Not only do they need silver, which they are extracting from various parts of the world that are not England, but they also need native speakers of lots of different languages. And so even though Oxford at the time that the book is set is very white, there is this sort of very multicultural group of people who work there, but it becomes clear that that system is incredibly exploitative, and that really at its heart, Babel doesn't really care so much about scholarship as it cares about preserving its own identity and, crucially, making a shit ton of money. So I think it was really, really cool for that. And I absolutely ate up like the first 4/5 of it. And then it got, the plot kind of just sped up a little too much for me. And I didn't always follow some of the nuances of like the character development that were happening in like that latter part. But I think like R F Kuang is so fucking clever, and I thought this book was really impressive, even if I didn't like cover to cover love it. So there is that. And then I listened to, is this my favourite book of the month? It's up there as one of the best books I read this month. I listened to the audiobook of The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, which is read by Kristin Atherton, who, as a side note, is one of my favourite audiobook narrators. I always love anything that Kristin Atherton narrates. And this is, as you may guess from the title, a offshoot of Pride and Prejudice. So The Other Bennet Sister follows Mary, who is the middle child of the Bennet sisters. You might remember her, if you're familiar with Pride and Prejudice, as being the kind of ugly duckling of the family, like a bit geeky, quite somber, quite just not the kind of effervescent wit that all of the other characters, all of the other sisters are. And I absolutely loved this book. You know, sometimes I think it's dangerous to do sometimes a spin-off of like such a well-established book, but I just thought that Janice Hadlow like absolutely killed it. It was such a like romp, but also really, really made you think again about some of the character interactions and things that happen in Pride and Prejudice. And you realise that sort of Mary is actually in some ways quite modern. I'm never going to look at Mary the same way again. So the book follows, I think like the first like maybe quarter to a third of the book is within the timeline of Pride and Prejudice, and then it carries on beyond the events of Pride and Prejudice. But oh my god, it gave me like those like warm kind of classic book feelings. And I'm not always a big one for like books that rely really heavily on a big kind of romantic storyline, but I loved this. I loved this so much. Oh, just do yourself a favour and get the audiobook. It's fantastic. So there was that. I then read, again, all of these are in the video, so I read Willowes by Sylvia Townsend Warner, which I picked because it's from the Autumn Clothbound Classics collection. So I figured, well, this must be autumnal. And it is autumnal. And I think it's, from having done some spot checky vague research online through my social media accounts, I didn't know something about this book that I think is quite widely known. So you're following the main character, Lolly, who is a woman who is unmarried and has been living with her father. The first part of the book, she's been living with her father, very, very happily, quite happily unmarried, likes her life in the country, doesn't really want it to change. But after her father dies, as a woman who, you know, is on her own, she isn't able to carry on living independently, so she has to go and live with her brother. And so the second part of the book, she is living with her brother, and there's all sorts of like funny kind of quiet social commentary stuff going on. And then in the third part of the book, Lolly kind of has had enough of sort of trying to fit herself into what society needs her to be, and she goes, fuck it, I'm not going to stay in my brother's house. I have some financial independence. I will go and live the life that I want to live. And off she goes to the countryside, to the Cotswolds, I think, like Oxfordshire way, to the countryside, and she sets up by herself there. And then it gets a little witchy woo, but like in a way that I was not expecting. I was expecting a little bit of mushroom picking after dark, but this book is bold, and I really enjoyed it. I do think the first parts are kind of laying the groundwork for the third part, and that at parts I wasn't like loving the not so much the writing, because I think Sylvia Townsend Warner is a really witty, clever writer, but just I couldn't feel where the story was going, but just trust that it's going somewhere. It is going somewhere. So that was Lolly Willowes. And then I listened to another audiobook. So the reason I was in a bad mood at the start of this month was because someone chopped down the sycamore tree at the Sycamore Gap. Now I know in the wider context of the world, that's not a thing to be crying about, but also I loved that tree. It was a real landmark up here in the Northeast, and I was very sad about it. So I read a book about trees. I read The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben, sorry, which was read by, let me check this, Mike Grady. And this is, so Peter Wohlleben is a, all my head can think of is woodsman. He's a forester. He's a forester, so it is his job essentially to look after forests, and the book is sort of about what he has learnt about trees over the course of his life, including sort of how they connect and how they support each other, and why trees that are kind of planted just in a quite a like monocultural way, as a lot of our kind of like forest industry is, not just in this country but elsewhere. So Peter Wohlleben is German and is writing predominantly about German forests, but it's kind of a translatable thing. And yeah, it was really interesting. Did I finish my point there? I got back from holiday in the early hours of this morning, and I've had a really full-on day at work, and now I'm recording this, and so I'm sorry, I am losing the plot, and forgive me. So what was I saying? Yeah, so how planting trees kind of in that quite monocultural way, because you go, well, we need loads of oak, so we'll just plant loads and loads of oak, and then we'll cut it down when they're like 30 years old or whatever. Like why that is not as good as, and never will be as good as, a properly integrated forest that has all of the different organisms working together that it needs to. So there was loads of stuff in there about like different animals and how they interact with trees, and like fungus and mosses and things like that. I did like it. it was interesting. 80% of it, maybe 90% of it has fallen out of my brain, but that's often what I find with nonfiction. I kind of like enjoy it while I'm reading it, and then the facts, they don't stay long. But I think if you're interested in trees or forestry, check it out. I had a nice time listening to it. And then another book that I absolutely loved was Jen Campbell's poetry collection, Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit. These are books that look at sort of, Jen is reflecting on kind of a lifetime of a hospital experience as a disabled woman who had to have a number of procedures in hospital, a number of operations when she was a child, a very young child, and then kind of throughout her childhood, and then as an adult going through IVF and being again in hospitals again, and sort of looking at that relationship, and their poems in here are interspersed with some of Jen's actual medical records, because she requested access to her medical records. And yeah, I thought it was brilliant. It was a real kind of interplay between the medical realm and the domestic realm, and sort of a lot about sort of motherhood. There was a brilliant poem in here called Trying to Gain Entry into the Republic of Motherhood, which is riffing on a Liz Berry poem called The Republic of Motherhood. And I just thought it was so great. And I really, really recommend it if you're looking for a contemporary poetry collection. Look no further. This is great. And then another book that I really liked. Yay! I love it when I can do this in a wrap up. Just be like, I loved this. I loved this. I loved this. This was English Animals by Laura Kaye. This is a sort of domestic drama book. It is set, so you're following a young girl, 19-year-old girl called Mirka, who is, don't get this wrong now, she's either from Slovakia or Slovenia, and I'm sure the people from those countries are so tired of people getting it wrong. Does it say here? No, it doesn't. I think it's Slovakia. Again, I just, the details, man, they don't, the brain can't hold them. But we're following Mirka, who has left home after her family kicked her out, after her mum discovered that she was having an affair with an older woman. And so Mirka made her way to the UK and has been kind of like working in crappy 0 hours contract kind of work, and she signs up with this agency that place people in kind of like fancy like country houses, normally as an au pair. But when she arrives at the house that she's been assigned to, there aren't any children there, and she was sort of expecting to take care of children. And she realizes that this married couple, Sophie and Richard, nailed it, Sophie and Richard, have just sort of hired her to kind of be around and just like help out. So Sophie has inherited the house, this big house, from her family. So while they are asset rich, they are not really doing so well for money, and they have various sort of harebrained schemes about how they're going to make money off of the estate, one of which is taxidermy, which Mirka ends up being very involved in. But at its core, this is a book about relationships, because Mirka begins a relationship with someone in the house, and it all becomes very like messy and difficult, and just like a really it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting, but it ended up being this really kind of compulsive, kind of steamy drama. But there was also a lot of stuff like going on more broadly about the political situation, obviously Mika being a migrant to the UK and then moving to quite a remote part of the country and hearing things about people's political opinions that she finds difficult to swallow. But yeah, I really liked it. Yay. And then the final book, I didn't actually finish reading this in the vlog, but I started talking about it, which is Now She Is Witch by Kirsty Logan. And I got about, I think maybe like 2/3 of the way through this, and then I was literally about to go on holiday. And I didn't think I wanted to bring it with me, partly because I was going to Portugal for some winter sun, and actually for that week of October, the autumnal vibes were not necessarily what I was after. But also I wasn't gripped by it, and I found this a couple of times with Kirsty Logan's books where I really want to like them, and I can tell, like, on a sentence level, I like her writing, and she writes about themes that I'm very interested in. It's all very feminist and queer, and there's real strong links to folklore. But I always find, or I have always found with the books of hers that I've read in the past, that there's just something in the like story beats and the narrative that I just find just not quite gripping. And this is about a woman called Lux who at the start of the book has returned home to a village, having been ejected, kicked out of a convent. And while she's been gone, her mother has been drowned for being a witch. And Lux is sort of trying to work out what to do with her life now. And she meets a woman who sort of tries to guide her and help her, but then for part of the book we get a big backstory of Lux when she was at the convent, and I actually loved that section. But the bits where Elsa and Lux were together felt a little bit meandering, and I couldn't really see where it was going. And then at the end, because I did bring it on holiday and I did finish reading it, I did feel much better about the book at the end than I did 3/4 of the way through. And I really liked the way some of the themes came back around, but there's just something that's stopping me loving it. But I suspect it's very much a me thing. So if you liked the like a vibe of that, I recommend you give it a go. So that was Now She Is Witch. And then I have 1, 2, 3 more audiobooks to talk to you about. I've had a very good time with my audiobooks this month. So I listened to The Subtweet by Vivek Shraya, which was read by Nisha Ahuja. And this is, I found this cover quite misleading because I thought it looked quite YA-ish, but this is actually a really, really interesting social commentary kind of contemporary feminist novel. So you're following 2 women who are both musicians. And what happens is we have, I can't remember any of the characters' names. We have one woman who's been cultivating this very kind of cool, quite esoteric music career, kind of a little bit jazzy, but also I think using quite a lot of like influences from traditional Eastern music. And she's got this kind of like cult following, but she's not like exploded. And then another younger, both the women are Asian American, and the younger one is just a big fan of the first woman, and she records a cover of one of her songs, and it goes absolutely viral. But the problem is that a lot of people don't know who the original artist is, haven't heard of her, so they think that the newer artist, the younger artist, has sort of invented that song. And even though she never tries to take credit for it, there's all of this rhetoric comes up in social media about how there's never been a singer like her, and how all these people, particularly like young Asian American women, are finally feeling seen. And from the perspective of the woman who's been doing this a while, she's like, well, hang on a second, I've been here. And so what follows is this really interesting relationship that builds between the two of them, because the younger one really admires the older one. I mean, she covered her song. I keep saying younger and older, they're not like that much apart in age. It's just because I'm a nightmare and I can't remember anyone's name. But yeah, so it ends up being this really great relationship story between these two women who have a lot of admiration and grudging respect for each other in some cases, but it's also about music and the music industry and race within the music industry, and how much space people of colour, particularly Asian women in this context, are allowed to take up within kind of popular music. And it's also about, you know, ego and friendship and ambition. And it's quite a short book. The audiobook was only like 5 hours, and it was really, really good. And I really recommend it. So, yay. And then the second book, second audiobook was Shrines of Gaiety by Kaye Atkinson, which was read by Jason Watkins. And again, I had such a good time with this. I always vibe a bit with historical fiction around autumn time. And this one definitely ticked the box. This is set in London in the sort of 1910s, 1920s. No, definitely 1910s. And we're following Nellie Coker, who is a sort of nightclub, what's the word I'm looking for? She's got a little empire. She's got a little empire of nightclubs in London, some seedier than others. And so it's got this cool kind of like jazzy noir thing going on. But at its core, it's also kind of a crime story, because there are these girls that keep going missing, and we follow the story from a few different perspectives. So we see from the Coker family, various members of the Coker family who are sort of, they're not quite gangsters, but they're definitely gangster adjacent. And then a couple of girls who have come down to London from York, who are very young and have disappeared. And then a woman who was friends with the older sister of one of those girls has come down to London looking for them. So you get the girls, you get the woman who's come to look for them, and you get the Cokers, and it's all very enmeshed. But it's really, really, really cool. I had a really nice time with it. If you're looking for a kind of page turnery, little bit seedy kind of historical crime book, I really recommend it. I've only read one other Kaye Atkinson book before, Life After Life, which, although I loved the concept of, I didn't actually love how the story played out in Life After Life, and I preferred this one quite a bit. So that was great. And then the final audiobook I have to talk to you about is The Catch by T.M. Logan. So I read off Jen Campbell's recommendation, actually, on her channel. I read The Curfew by T.M. Logan earlier this year, which is a kind of, he writes sort of crime books, but they're kind of crime thrillers, but they're quite domestic. At least the two now that I've read are quite domestic. So you're looking at the families that are enmeshed in various crimes or potential crimes. And this one was really interesting. So it was about a father whose beloved daughter has been sort of swept off her feet by this older man, and after 7 months they're engaged and everyone thinks he's amazing because he was like in the army and now he's like got this great job in recruitment and he's got a like first class degree in psychology and he's just the absolute fucking shit, right? But the dad is like there's something up with this man, and everyone thinks he's being paranoid. Everyone thinks he's just being this overprotective dad, and you don't know for quite a long time whether or not that's true. So you either think, and he like, this dad goes like a little bit overboard, let's say. He's like tailing him, he's getting people to dig into his past, like it's a lot, and it really starts affecting his relationships with his wife and with his daughter. And meanwhile, like Mr. Perfect is still being like Mr. Perfect and like taking it all on the chin, and you think like, what is actually going on here? Is this dad just like super paranoid, kind of like, I mean, I know he is a dad, so like literally he is this word, but really kind of paternalistic, and doesn't really seem to respect his daughter or his wife's judgment. But at the same time, you're like, but there is something a bit about this guy. And that's kind of the book. And then I'm obviously not going to tell you what happens in the end. But yeah, it was really just good page-turny crime fiction. I didn't like it as much as The Curfew. I don't know if a little bit of that was because this narrator, did I say that it was read by Philip Stevens? Was really, really good. But The Curfew was read by Richard Armitage, and that just added another layer of enjoyment for me. But yeah, I will continue to reach for T.M. Logan as a kind of go-to crime writer for me now. I've quite enjoyed both of those books, so that's good. And then finally, last book I read this month, I read an ebook of Memorial by Bryan Washington. And this is a book that I've been meaning to read for ages because I read Bryan Washington's short story collection, Lot, which if you've been here a little while, you will know me and short stories are not always friends. We're almost never friends. But I did quite like Bryan Washington's collection, not in its entirety because I never bloody do with short story collections, but there was a lot in there that I liked enough for me to know that when he brought out a novel, I would really be interested in reading it. And if you've read Bryan Washington's writing before, Memorial is a lot of similar themes. It's looking at queer male identities and race particularly, and how those intersect in kind of the modern day. And the book is following the relationship, or potentially the breakdown of a relationship between two men, Benson, who is an African-American man, and Mike, who is American-Japanese. And they've been in a relationship for a little while. And at the start of the book, we find out that Mike has just decided to fly out to Japan because his estranged father, who walked out on him when he was like a teenager, is on his deathbed. And Mike just really feels like he needs to go and spend time with his dad. All very good and fine, except that prior to this happening, Mike had invited his mother over from Japan, who is also estranged from the father. Because the dad walked out on them, invited her to come and stay with them in Florida. So what he says to Ben is that Mike is going to fly to Japan, and Ben's going to stay in Florida with his mum, who he's not met before. And the way the book's structured, you get a big chunk from Ben's perspective. And it's great because you kind of end up getting, you're like, yeah, Mike, you fucking prick. You get all of Ben's kind of memorializing, like recollections from their from their relationship, everything he's annoyed at Mike about, everything that's happening with him and the mum. But then you go to Japan and you see what Mike's dealing with, and you get Mike's interpretation of the relationship and what he's been dealing with in the past. And then you get a little bit at the end that's a bit more the two of them together. I really liked the way that, well, firstly, I really liked both of the characters of Ben and Mike. I think they were both very, very flawed, but they felt quite real. However, oh my God, it's like, you know, when you're reading something and you're like, I just wish these people would communicate with each other better. There was enough in their backstories for me to understand why they struggled to communicate with each other. But oh my God, was it frustrating. Which is the point, I think. It's kind of what Bryan Washington is exploring. But I was really sad by the end. And yeah, I just really felt for both of them. But this is not a book that's going to give you very much resolution. And yeah, it's definitely, if you struggle to deal with people who can't communicate with each other, then like, I still think you should read it, but just tread with caution and know that that frustration is definitely going to come up. I absolutely loved, Mike works in kitchens, and I loved all of the food descriptions in this book. It made me so hungry for Japanese food. But yeah, I really liked it. As in and amongst all of the relationship stuff, there was just a lot in there about coming out and families being more or less accepting of that. And as I said about race, there was this really particular kind of point of where Ben and Mike would butt heads a lot, because Ben sort of believes that his situation growing up was worse than Mike's, because he thinks it's harder to be black in America than to be Asian. But Mike grew up with significantly less money than Benson, who grew up with actually quite in kind of quite an affluent middle class home, although not without its challenges. And they kept having this sort of like altercation about it in various different points throughout their relationship, and I think that was like really interesting the way that was explored. And I also thought Mike's mum was fucking ace. She was so cool. Yeah, so I think Bryan Washington continues to be a writer whose work I will always pick up and enjoy, even if this one sort of didn't give me the resolution that I was kind of craving for my own sake, as well as the characters. And yeah, that has been October. So all in all, pretty good going, really. Pretty good going. I would love to know what you've been reading in October, what your plans are for November. It's non-fiction November, isn't it? I just don't really know if I'm feeling non-fiction at the minute, but I may try and push through. So if you've got some good kind of non-fiction recommendations for someone who's maybe not feeling very non-fiction-y, maybe some good memoir, could you drop that in the comments down below? I would be very, very appreciative. And yeah, hope you've been reading good things and eating delicious food and staying warm now that the weather has turned. And I'll be seeing you for another video very soon. Bye.